Hi, this is History with me, Dan. In this video, we're going to take a look at Old Wethersfield. It's the largest historic district in the state of Connecticut, and I got pretty familiar with it while working for 16 years at the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum, which is located right on Main Street in the middle of the district. Old Wethersfield is filled with a lot of great early American buildings, mostly houses dating to the 1700s and the first half of the 1800s. In fact, there's over 150 houses from that period. Now, because Old Wethersfield is so big, I can't talk about all of it in one video. So in this video, we're going to focus on the area around the intersection of Main Street with Marsh Street and Church Street, south to the area of the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum, the Hurlbut-Dunham House, and the Keeney Cultural Center. In another video, I hope to talk about the section of Main Street just south of this area, and then also in another video the section north of this area, up towards Wethersfield Cove. And also to the east of Main Street is Broad Street Green, which also deserves its own video. So let's start at the intersection where Main Street meets with Garden and Church Streets. There's a church here, what would have been called the Meeting House back in colonial days. Wethersfield was founded back in 1634 by a group of Puritan adventurers, and like other Puritan towns in Old New England, it would have been centered around the Meeting House, which was both a house of worship and the center of local government. The current church or meeting house here was built in 1761, but the original meeting house, back in the 1600s, would have been right in the middle of the intersection nearby. The current First Church of Christ of Wethersfield is the direct descendant of that original wooden meeting house. The present building was built in 1761. If you look at the south side of the building, it really does resemble a large house, actually. And this would have been the original entrance. But this building has other influences, and the steeple, which is quite elaborate, was modeled more on Episcopal churches, which was unusual at the time for a Puritan Congregationalist building. In 1774, when John Adams was visiting Wethersfield, he went up the steeple and admired the view and wrote that it was, quote, the most grand and beautiful prospect in the world, at least that I ever saw, unquote. Just behind the church is the Old Burying Ground, also called the Old Wethersfield Village Cemetery. It started out on Hungry Hill, just east of the church, back in 1638, and it eventually grew to fill in the areas around the hill, all the way down to Marsh Street. So the cemetery is on the north side of Marsh Street, and on the south side there are several houses. One of them is a gambrel-roofed house built in 1760 for the sea captain Gershom Knott. The house has a replica of the original Connecticut River Valley-style doorway, characterized by a broken scroll swan's neck pediment. Also on Marsh Street is the Peter Burnham House, built around 1757 and currently painted blue. It actually used to be on the burying ground side of Marsh Street, but was moved across the street in the 1960s. Returning to Main Street, just south of the church and the intersection with Marsh Street, is the 1787 Deming-Standish House, which also has a gambrel roof, but represents a transition to the federal style of architecture, including a tripartite window above the front door. The house is currently home to Lucky Lou's Bar and Grill. Just to the south is the Hurlbut-Dunham House, which is operated as a museum by the Wethersfield Historical Society. This house is a real architectural hybrid. It was built in 1804 as a brick Federal-style house, and like the Deming-Standish House, has a tripartite window above the front door. But in the 1850s, the house was significantly altered in the Italianate style. The front and side porticos feature columns and brackets. There are also brackets along the roof cornice, and the house is topped by an Italianate-style cupola as well. Returning to the intersection, diagonally across from the church, at the southwest corner of Main and Church Streets, are commercial buildings dating to the early 20th century. These buildings took the place of older houses that had once been here. One house that had stood here was moved, however, just around the corner of Church Street. This is the Edward Shepherd House, built in 1807. That was 20 years after the Deming-Standish House was built, and only 3 years after the Hurlbut-Dunham House. And like those two earlier houses, the Shepherd House was also built in the Federal style, and also has a tripartite window above the front door. Just south of the commercial building on Main Street is the Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum. The museum consists of 3 houses. The oldest is the Webb House in the middle, built in 1752 by the merchant and slave owner Joseph Webb. Like the Knott House that I showed earlier on Marsh Street, the Webb House has a large gambrel roof. This allowed the house to have a large attic for storing merchant goods. The house's current Greek Revival front portico was added in the early 19th century. The house would have originally had a Connecticut River Valley-style doorway like the one on the nearby Knott House. The Webb House is most famous because in 1781, Joseph Webb's son, also named Joseph, was the host to George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau when they had a conference here to plan the joint American and French campaign that would end a few months later with victory at Yorktown. Just south of the Webb House is the Silas Deane House, which was built around 1770. Like Webb, Deane was a merchant and slave owner. He had married Joseph Webb's widow Mehitable in 1763. The house was unusual because its front facade was not symmetrical. It also would have originally had a front portico called a piazza, which was later removed. During the American Revolution, Deane served in the Continental Congress, and in 1776 he crossed the Atlantic on a mission for the Congress to get aid from the French government. This was before Benjamin Franklin later joined him, and together with Arthur Lee of Virginia, they were the 3 commissioners who secured the 1778 Treaty of Alliance with France, which led to Rochambeau's arrival to support George Washington's Continental Army. The third museum house, just north of the Webb House, was built in 1788–89 for Isaac Stevens, a leather worker. Between the Webb House and the Stevens House is a gravel path leading to the Webb Barn in the rear, which is a popular wedding venue. Each of the museum houses has a period outhouse in the rear. The rear of the Stevens House is not as decorative as the front because it would not have been viewed by passers-by in the street. Attached at the rear of the neighboring Webb House is a kitchen ell with a brick chimney and back wall. This was added to the house around the time the first church was being built and utilized the same bricks. Behind the house is a colonial revival-style garden designed in 1921 by the landscape architect Amy Cogswell. The Webb-Deane-Stevens Museum is owned by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in Connecticut. As I mentioned, just across the street is the Hurlbut-Dunham House, which is owned by the Wethersfield Historical Society. The Society also has exhibits in the building just to the south of the Hurlbut-Dunham House. This is the Keeney Memorial Cultural Center, which was built in 1893 as a public high school. The building was renovated to become a cultural center in 1985 with support from Emma Keeney. It was named in honor of her son, Robert Allen Keeney, who was lost at age 21 when the USS Indianapolis was sunk in the final days of World War II. If you want me to make more videos like this covering Wethersfield and other places, please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, you might also like watching my Old Wethersfield walking tour.